Lawmakers are back in session next week, and they have a lot to consider. We'll tell you what to watch for up next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning into this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine. And with me today is a longtime Statehouse watcher and political commentator Mike Lawrence. Mike, thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
And Dave McKinney, Statehouse Bureau Chief for the Chicago Sun-Times. Dave, thanks for coming.
Jamey, thanks.
As I said at the top of the show, lawmakers come back from their long spring break. They were out for about 2 weeks, and they're going to be keeping us pretty busy next week. There's a lot going on. First off, Dave, we kind of want to catch up on what's been going on with Representative Derek Smith. He was indicted this week. Looks like he might come back to the General Assembly next week. What's going on with Representative Smith?
Well, I think you're right, Jamey. It's going to be quite a spectacle when he comes back as an indicted sitting public official. He was indicted by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago on a single count of bribery, and this stems from an undercover sting that the feds did with him a month or so ago, where he accepted $7,000 in cash from a fictitious owner of a daycare operator in his district. And the deal was that Smith would write a letter of recommendation to the state Capital Development Board to free up $50,000 in state funds for this daycare operator. The deal was captured on tape by the feds, so he's proclaiming his innocence, but in these cases where the feds have people on tape, as we've seen with Rod Blagojevich, they're very difficult to mount a defense against. And so I think, again, we're going to see him coming back here. He's refused to resign. It's a point of leverage for him, honestly, as he tries to cut a deal for himself. But it's going to be a spectacle. People are going to probably, the politicians here are going to want to keep a distance from him, knowing that he's trying to cut a deal with the U.S. Attorney's Office. So he's going to be scorned on one hand and then sought out by, all of us in the media trying to, find out, what were you thinking?
Well, and he was part of a sting. There's an informant working with the feds. So lawmakers are probably a little worried as to why they were looking at him in the first place and whether he's going to try to maybe give the feds something on somebody else to lessen his time. Mike, have we seen something like this in the past where someone who is this much controversy come back and participate in the General Assembly, and what will it do as far as the process? Will it distract too much, or is it something that they can deal with, do you think?
Well, these are different times. In the mid-'70s, about 7% of the Illinois General Assembly was under indictment. And some of them, as I recall, resigned, but there were others who continued to serve while they were under indictment. And there was not the kind of outrage among their colleagues that we're seeing in this situation. And as I say, we're in different times now, but even in terms of tape, they had some of these lawmakers on tape back then. And almost all of them ultimately were convicted. And once they were convicted, that took care of the issue as to whether they could serve. But this is new in the sense of it's happening in a different time and a different framework.
At that time, was this a situation where they were all connected in some issue? Was it something where people had been caught? Of course, you're innocent until proven guilty, but this is a case that we're looking at now where there is some red-handed catching going on here. I mean, they caught him accepting the money. Was it a case where people had really been kind of busted in this fashion?
Well, what happened, there were actually different instances involved, but there was one major instance which snared the most of them, and it involved bribery related to doubling the maximum load limit on Illinois roads for cement trucks. And the cement industry had bribed legislators. There were two ringleaders among the legislators. They recruited some of their colleagues, and then the ringleaders among the legislators turned into government witnesses. And one of the ringleaders served no time in prison. The other did do time. But it was a huge story at that time, and the fact that they had taped their colleagues when that came out, that really was a major deal in the legislature.
And I bet that was very interesting as a reporter covering all the paranoia that was probably coming out of that. And was it a pretty big distraction or not so much?
Well, it took a lot of my time because I was working at that time for the Quad City Times, and the two ringleaders were from the Quad City area. And I covered the trial in the U.S. District Court in Chicago. They were indicted while a guy named Jim Thompson was the United States Attorney up there before he ran for governor and became governor. And I told at that point, there were, with the 7% under indictment, I told my office that I might be having to cover the General Assembly from Leavenworth rather than from Springfield eventually. But you just did, at that point, there was kind of a feeling, well, this stuff has gone on for years and some people got caught. And the other interesting angle out of that was the legislators were so outraged that the people in the cement industry who bribed these legislators got immunity in order to testify for the government, and they were so outraged that they passed legislation that said if you bribed a legislator or admitted in a court of law that you had bribed a legislator, you could no longer do business with the state of Illinois. So a lot of the outrage at that time was not against the legislators, it was against the people who did the bribing and got immunity.
Of course, in this case, that was actually the feds who were doing the bribing because it was a sting, so this daycare did not actually offer a bribe. But Dave, a lot of folks have called for Representative Smith to step down, and he has ignored those calls. Why come back now? Well,
again, I think what this is all about is him trying to retain any point of leverage that he can and trying to cut a deal for himself. I mean, one of the things I didn't mention out of the gate was that there's a special committee that's been formed in the House to possibly expel him. I expect those efforts to accelerate now because he's not going to step down. And the other element of this that's so interesting is that this gentleman has very close ties to Secretary of State Jesse White. Mm-hmm. He's a former employee of the Secretary of State's office, and Secretary White engineered his appointment to the House in last year when the former rep then was appointed to the Senate. And so, it's going to be interesting to see to what extent, if any, Secretary White gets ensnared in this in some way, either as a witness or whatever. But it's just a fascinating little thing. Just when we think we've kind of put all the corruption stuff to bed, here crops up a brand new one that has all the intrigue of a great political whodunit,
And his lawyers kind of hinted at that the feds might be looking at something that was going on in White's office at the time that he was there. Do you think that's all bluster, or do you think folks are worried about that?
Well, I think the fact that they, it seems like in any of these big sprawling federal investigations we see, they're always kind of aiming for the top. And sometimes they get there, sometimes they don't. And, for aspiring prosecutors, having the pelt of a household political name in the state is a good thing to have. And so, I think Secretary White probably has got a little bit of heartburn, I would say, over this. Of course, there's been no implication of any wrongdoing on his part. The indictment didn't name him or, allege any wrongdoing on his part or any of his staff or anything. But just that he kind of comes out of the White organization, out of that political hemisphere, it's hitting awfully close to home, for him.
Well, and you mentioned this special investigative committee, which has been put together to decide whether or not any action should be taken. They will presumably be having hearings, and they would like the representative to come to these hearings and testify under oath. it'll be a little awkward if he's in town and he doesn't show up to those, right? Do you think he'll go?
Yeah, I don't see how he does go. I mean, it would be, he'd be, really messing himself up legally to do that. I think, the committee has asked for a bunch of things from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I think they're waiting to, find out what, if anything, that Patrick Fitzgerald is willing to give them. I mean, if you remember in the Blagojevich case, when the House was studying impeachment and the Senate took it up, the U.S. Attorney released 4 tapes that showed Blagojevich and his agents basically kind of doing the same thing, where they were soliciting campaign contributions in exchange for official action. And those tapes, are invaluable not only in court but in the political world, because it'll as I said earlier, it'll accelerate this thing. And they'd like access to some of the witnesses. I mean, some of this stuff, of course, they won't get, but they'd like to have a little bit of that. And it'll be a lot of good drama for the spring, I'm sure. I mean, I think this thing probably, with him wanting to hold on, it's going to drag on for at least a couple of months.
I don't, unless I missed it, I don't think we know right now what led the feds to do this thing. And just speculating, they must have had some information that he was involved, allegedly involved in wrongdoing, but it also makes you wonder whether it wasn't part of a larger investigation, perhaps involving other legislators or other state officials.
Mike, for many, many months, probably I would say dating back at least a couple of years, there have just been a flurry of federal subpoenas that have come not only from Springfield but Chicago to different state agencies inquiring about grants, grantees. And many of these are legislative initiatives. You can trace them back, a lot of them, to legislators who helped arrange these grants, and the agencies are swamped. There's very little oversight of how the money is spent. And one little footnote that came out in the Smith indictment that is interesting is of the $7,000 he took in cash, the feds can only account for $4,500 of it. So $2,500 of it is, gone on who knows what.
Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely be keeping track of this as it progresses, but I'd like to move on from scandal to policy now. Next week, the General Assembly is back in session, and a couple of policy proposals are scheduled to drop. Governor Pat Quinn has called for pension reform and Medicaid reform sometime this year, and both of those plans, or at least the sketches of some of those plans, are supposed to come from advisory committees. Let's start out with pensions. Dave, can you kind of give me a rundown just of what is being looked at that could be included in a possible pension plan in the future?
Well, I mean, of course, what the business groups and the Republicans have been pushing hard for, and there's even been some support from the House Speaker on it, is finding a way to go after the retirement benefits of existing state workers. That's where the big money is at, and there's the constitutionality of that has always come into question. The Senate President's legal counsel has drafted a lengthy opinion that says you can't in any way touch that. And so we've this has been going on now for several years, where this back and forth, and it's hard to envision that we're going to see really substantive movement on attacking the benefits of existing workers. I mean, I think what we're likely to see is some nibbling around the edges here, to basically make it seem as if, to the bond houses and everybody else, that the state's doing something to try to corral, these pension systems that are, $85 billion and up in the hawk right now. I think, what we might see, I mean, the Speaker Madigan introduced a piece of legislation that would make it more difficult to, pass along these pension sweeteners and what have you. I mean, they're going to do something. I don't think anybody in the building expects that it's going to be the end-all, be-all to deal with this problem, because that problem is so massive that getting it done in 7 weeks, I mean, just seems impossible.
Well, it seems like the Democratic leaders agree on the possibility of pushing some of the costs down to local school districts, maybe universities. Dave, is that something we might see happen?
Well, I mean, I think that's an easy route to go, but of course it comes with the same kind of political consequences that going after the existing retirees does, because what that does is shift the burden to the property taxpayer. And where you see that, downstate and in the suburbs, people have fought increases in property tax bills. It's been a giant political bullet, if you will, for a lot of politicians. They get snared up in it. We saw in the 1990s there was an effort to reel in property tax increases through the property tax cap bill that Governor Edgar signed. And so that's the problem with doing that. They may be able to wash their hands of it, and it would apply to future retirees. Again, it doesn't, as I understand it, it doesn't really get at this $85 billion elephant in the room.
Well, and Mike, you touched on House Speaker Michael Madigan did propose something this week that would make it harder to raise benefits in the future. Can you explain that a little bit? That looks like something that people might be interested in.
It's a proposed constitutional amendment, and if adopted, it would require a 3/5 vote of each house of the General Assembly to approve pension benefits.
An increase in the future.
Additional pension benefits. And it would also raise the requirement to override a governor's veto to 2/3 from 3/5. So right now, pension additional benefits can be approved with a simple majority, constitutional majority. And so it would then go to an extraordinary majority to approve the benefits, and it is now 3/5 to override a gubernatorial veto, and it would take it to 2/3. In the past, there has been legislation which, even if it didn't deal directly with the pension, it kind of got at least an issue that has resulted in pensions being increased, and that was mandate, no legislation. This was, it was enacted into law that it would take 3/5 for the General Assembly to impose a mandate on local government. And one example of a mandate, unfunded mandate, were raising local pension benefits. But that was done by law, and so what happened was the General Assembly, by simple majorities, just suspended the law, said, the law doesn't matter here. If it's in the Constitution, that does put a lot more of a oomph behind the policy.
One of the things that I think would be interesting to see as well is another Edgar era piece of law that went into effect dealing with getting the pension systems funded by 2045, I think to 80%. Those have set up these escalating requirements that the state just keep paying, billions and billions of dollars more per year, and that's basically shunting out all the other state services. And I think some of the unions have floated this idea. I think there is some support to trying to maybe tweak that law in some way so that it reduces the pressure. But again, you do that, and you get the state's bond rating at risk again, because the bond houses look at this and realize you're still, if you're not going to be putting the money that's required to get these systems, back functioning the way they should, you're not really tackling the issue. So I think that law is probably also under the magnet.
Yeah, and it is a law, as David said, and so. We saw when Blagojevich and the legislature, the Democrat majority in the legislature, decided to take what's called a pension holiday from meeting those payments a few years ago. What they did, they suspended the law. So
with a simple majority vote.
Yeah. So I think if they're serious about this, maybe they put that kind of provision in the Constitution. That makes it much more difficult to mess around with it.
I love that phrase, pension holiday. Isn't that hilarious?
Yeah,
It should be such fun to go on holiday, shouldn't it?
Well, another event that's taking place next week that's going to draw a lot of attention, and that's a little connected to pensions, is Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker is coming to visit Illinois. The Business Lobby Day that happens every year, where the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups come and lobby the legislature. They have a big event. They usually have a keynote speaker. And Scott Walker is going to be their keynote speaker this year. Their hopes are that he might, his presence may put some pressure on some of these issues especially looking at pension reductions, pension changes, because he made some changes in Wisconsin. Dave, this is going to be, again, a little bit of a circus because he is embroiled in his own situations in his state. He is facing a recall election. Is this an effective tactic? Do you think lawmakers are going to take notice with him being here? As far as, I think the message they're trying to send is that Illinois needs to shape up on some of these things. Look at what Wisconsin did. Do you think that's going to work out at all?
No.
As
I mean,
a
it's a very antagonistic move, and I would say probably kind of a foolish move on the part of the business groups to try to, push the pension issue. Because anybody who's kind of watched this, they know that of all the people, Senate President John Cullerton and Governor Quinn have both they really seem not to like
They're not fans,
Scott Walker.
no.
and so you have this, he's a polarizing figure. The unions are going to be showing up in force. I even heard a rumor that there were live rats being ordered up. We'll see if that materializes. But some of the unions are.
I'll wear my high heels that
exactly.
day.
They're having like a gigantic show here. The Democrats, of course, are going to ignore him. There will be a handful of Republicans. I would be surprised that we're going to see like the gubernatorial wannabes on the Republican side wanting to have their picture taken with a man who could be driven from office in June. So I just don't think we're going to see a whole lot of reaction from the General Assembly to this guy's speech. So again, what is accomplished here other than a one-day, kind of screeching headline, I don't fully understand.
I agree entirely with Dave on that. And the fact of the matter is, through the years, when it comes to changing things dramatically in Illinois, and what other states have done is used as a model, in other words, suggested as a model. The attitude typically among Illinois legislators and state officials is, well, this is Illinois. We're different. And so I'd be hard-pressed to think of a time when some outside public official came in and really influenced public policy in Illinois, and I think it is an irritant, and it's confrontational in a way, and when you are trying to get things done, being confrontational isn't always the best way to do it. In fact, most of the times it's not the best way to do it.
Yeah, it can land people in a doghouse for a long time,
Well, the other issue that lawmakers will be considering this week is Medicaid. Governor Pat Quinn has called for $2.7 billion in cuts in Medicaid growth for next fiscal year. It's a huge task. No other states have really tried to cut this much in recent years. And again, the framework of a plan is supposed to come down next week. Dave, how much should we expect here? I'm hearing maybe we won't get a lot of specifics yet, but maybe some broad strokes.
Yeah, I think not long ago, within the last couple of weeks, the legislature, or at least the Senate, had a rare committee of the whole meeting where the National Conference of State Legislatures sent some of their best people to talk about how other states have dealt with this. And one of the things that sort of struck me from that was that these kinds of cuts that occur not only imperil federal funding. There's the matching element that comes along with whatever the state puts into the system. They get matches from the federal government. But what also the experience of other states is that when they're trying to cut, billions of dollars, they don't tend to do it in 1 year, because in doing that you're basically taking a butcher knife to the system. And with it being in a bad, we're in a bad economy, the need for subsidies like this are enhanced. And so that's the difficulty here. You're going to have to be scaling back eligibility for programs, telling people they can't have cavities filled. They can't have health screenings. These are people who can't afford barely to pay a grocery bill. And so politically, a lot of those folks, are the ones who can least afford to be hurt by this. And so I think it's going to be very hard to pull together a plan.
Yeah, Mike, I'm curious on your thoughts on this, because you served under Governor Edgar, who did have to make some Medicaid cuts that people were pretty upset about at the time. Times are different now in that there are more restrictions based on federal law. But what are your thoughts generally for the lawmakers that are trying to figure this out?
Well, these aren't easy cuts. Some of the actions taken so far to try to curb Medicaid spending are relatively easy. For example, having recipients prove their income that regularly. In other words, demonstrate that they are impoverished and eligible. Well, the feds have balked at giving the state waivers to do even that. So you have the situation where if the state's going to do anything significant, as Dave indicated, you will need federal approval, and so that's an issue. When Governor Edgar came into office, the state had what we thought was a horrendous deficit of $1.5 billion, which doesn't look so horrendous today.
It's a rounding error today.
Yeah. But Governor Edgar set a policy that we were, to the greatest extent we could, we would protect benefits for children. Well, that meant cutting dental benefits for adults. And Governor Edgar did not run for governor because he wanted to cut Medicaid dental benefits for adults. But he felt that balance the budget, we needed to do that. That was a tough vote. The thing to remember, to get the General Assembly to go along, it's not only a matter of some members really caring about impoverished people, but you also have members, including many Republicans, who care a lot about the providers, the hospitals, and other providers. And those providers are arguing against going too deeply. So I'm wondering if the General Assembly will do something, at least in this area, and maybe some others, like it did a couple of years ago, where they send Quinn an amount of money for Medicaid, which it represents a quote cut, but they don't make the decisions as to what in particular you cut.
Well, and I hate to cut you off, Mike, but we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests today, Mike Lawrence and Dave McKinney. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll be back next week on Capitol View. But until then, you can check us out on our Facebook page, Capitol View Politics at Facebook, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.